Good morning, everybody. In this video, I want to talk about complex sentences. Before that, I will explain the difference between an independent and a dependent clause. We will also discuss subordinators. Let's start with clauses. Let's see what a clause is. A clause is a group of words that contains at least one subject and one verb. Look at these two clauses. The student arrived late because she wasn't feeling well. What is the difference between them? As you see, the first clause is a complete one. It stands by itself. It is a sentence. Nothing is missing. The idea is complete. But what about the second one? Because she wasn't feeling well. You can see that this clause is not a sentence because the idea is not complete. You know that something is missing. The first clause is an independent clause because it stands by itself. But the second one is a dependent one. It needs another clause or sentence to be completed. Now, let's take a look at the second example. When you start college, here you are waiting for some other words to complete your idea. So it is not a complete sentence. It is in fact a dependent clause. You sometimes have to take a placement test. This sentence is complete. It can stand by itself. The idea is complete. So it is an independent clause. Now that you have learned the difference between dependent and independent clauses, we can say that an independent clause can be a sentence by itself. We join two independent clauses by using conjunctions such as and, but, or, so, for, yet, and nor. The following sentence is both a simple sentence and at the same time an independent clause. The professor provided his email address. So it is a simple sentence and also an independent clause. The following sentence is a compound sentence with two independent clauses. The professor provided his email address, but some students did not write it down. As you see, we have used comma to separate the sentences, and we have joined them by using but, which is a conjunction. An independent clause, in contrast, cannot be a sentence by itself. As I've already mentioned, the meaning is not complete, and we are waiting for some other words to complete the idea. A dependent clause depends on something else to complete its meaning. Look at the examples. So that students could send in their compositions. You know that something has been said before and the meaning is not complete because they were not paying attention. This clause is not a complete sentence, so it needs some other words or sentence or maybe a clause to be complete. Now let's see which clause is dependent and which one is independent in this example. Since this is a required course, you must take it. That's right. Since this is a required course is a dependent clause, you must take it is an independent clause. Subordinators. A dependent adverb clause always begins with a subordinating conjunction or a subordinator. We have different kinds of subordinators: time subordinators, purpose, conditional, and reason subordinators. So time subordinators begin a clause that tells when something happens. Look at the first example. He goes to school after he finishes work. So after is a subordinator, and it's actually a time subordinator, and after starts a sentence, which is the time of the sentence after he finishes work. It shows when the first sentence happens. Reason subordinators begin a clause that tells why something happens. In the second example, I did well on my exam because I studied hard. So the reason of doing well on the exam is studying hard. So before the reason, we have used a reason subordinator here because. Purpose subordinators begin a clause that tells the purpose or objective of an event or action. As you see in the example, after so that, we have mentioned the purpose and objective of the first sentence. So I studied hard. Why? So that I would do well on the exam. And this is the purpose. And finally, conditional subordinates begin a clause that tells the condition under which something can occur. If you look at the last example and the second part of it, you must be sure to follow them. So there is a condition for this sentence. If your professor gives a list of class rules, you must be sure to follow them. So the first sentence after if is the condition for the second sentence. Now that you have learned the difference between independent and independent clauses, the definition of a clause and subordinators, we can explain complex sentences and it is easier to understand. So a complex sentence is a combination of one independent clause and one or more dependent clauses. If you look at these examples, you see an independent clause and a dependent clause. Altogether, they make a complex sentence. The student arrived late because she wasn't feeling well. So the first one, the first sentence and clause, the student arrived late, is an independent clause. Because she wasn't feeling well is a dependent clause. Look at the second example. The professor gave the class his email address. This is an independent clause. It can stand by itself. It is a complete sentence. It doesn't need any other words to be completed. But what about the second part? So that students could send in their compositions. So this part is a dependent clause. It can't stand by itself. The meaning is not complete. It needs the first part to be completed. Now let's talk about the order of a complex sentence when there are both independent and dependent clauses. We can say that when an independent clause comes at the beginning of the sentence, we don't have to separate it from the dependent ones and we don't use a comma. But when a dependent clause precedes the independent clause, we need a comma after that, and then we use the independent clause in the second part. So as you see, the yellow sentences, or the sentences in yellow, there is a difference between them. The first one, in the first one, the order is different from the second one. In the first sentence, we have used the independent clause at the beginning and then the dependent clause. And we don't need a comma to separate them. But for the second sentence, we have used the dependent clause before the independent one, and we have used a comma to separate them. Remember that subordinators are very clear signs of dependent clauses. And when you see because, you understand that this clause is dependent. For example, I say, I was sick. This sentence is a complete one. It doesn't have any subordinators, and it has the main idea, and it doesn't need other words to be complete. But when I use because before this and say because I was sick, so the meaning of the sentence is not complete. And because makes this sentence an independent and a dependent one. So dependent sentences often have subordinators. Thank you for paying attention.